And I'm Kiera. I work for an organization called ConnectEd, and we are currently supporting several school districts in California to through some Gates funding to implement various versions of illustrative mathematics with a sort of the long-range objective of essentially modernizing the mathematics experience that students are having in classrooms, thinking about college and career readiness, and also we are very focused on creating opportunities for students to develop their language skills and sort of the importance of building those language opportunities into the learning experiences, in particular for students who are multilingual learners. And I will pass it to Tamyra, because you're on my left.
All right, so thank you, Vinci, for your warm introduction into the conversation. I'm Tamyra Walker. I am the director of STEM for Envision Schools. Like Vinci said, I've been in education. This is my 17th year. So I started, I taught for 10 years. I taught grades 1 through 8. I taught math, primarily taught reading for a couple of years, which was just a gateway into teaching math, because that wasn't for me. I also did some work in workforce development. So I've worked from the very beginning of the STEM pipeline towards the end by helping young people get computer coding training and then finding their way into industry. So the work that I do, and we specifically focused on BIPOC youth. So the work that I do is about advancing equity all throughout the STEM pipeline. That's my calling. And it's been, a fun journey, lots of rigor and lots of challenge in it. And this year I decided to kind of help with some of the staffing issues that we have. So I actually took on a pre-calculus course. So I'm teaching pre-calculus and really trying to reimagine what 12th grade math should be as we think about having students kind of prepped and engaging with rigor. So that's been really good to be back with students again. So thank you for having me in this conversation. And I will pass it to Richie. I hope it's appropriate to call you that. I'm sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, Richie is good for me.
Okay.
Thanks for having me here too, Vinci. I appreciate the invite. I'm excited to hear the conversation that we have here. I teach 6th grade math at this new school in San Diego called Logan Memorial. And it's a first of its kind in California, as I understand it. It's a cradle to career school where we're taking kids as young as 1 and 2 years old and taking them all the way through to 12th grade into their careers. I teach 6th grade math, all math. I'm a relatively new teacher. I've been teaching this my 4th year, I think. And so my whole teaching approach has changed in 4 years like you wouldn't believe. Thanks to some really good mentors like Andrea Bear from Math Transformations, Vinci, Daro, Tamar Posner. I've had the opportunity to really have conversations with some really great people. And I'm also trying to reimagine how we teach 6th grade math. And a lot of what I do, I feel, is successful because of the relationships I build. That's kind of my thing I'm really focused on, community meetings and that kind of stuff. So I'm excited to be here and look forward to the conversations. I'll pass it to Catherine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Lanouette. I'm a learning scientist interested in how to support science and data science learning in K through 12 and field-based settings. And to date, I've been really focusing a lot on studying the potential and pitfalls of place-based learning and emerging technologies to help kids learn with and about data. I'm really curious, though, how to do this in ways that are kind of imaginative and playful, and at the same time, ambitious and rigorous. So I've collaborated a lot with public schools and community organizations. And I'm currently an assistant professor at William and Mary, which is a public liberal arts research university here in Virginia. That's why it's dark in the background. But prior to this, I lived in Berkeley for many years, both as a PhD student and a postdoc researcher. And in that time, I did a lot of collaborative research with local public schools at the elementary level, really kind of thinking about how could data science and data be integral to science and math learning. And I would just say my interest is really motivated by, prior to all that, teaching for 9 years in New York City in schools and informal settings. And really just being curious of how can you kind of do better in schools? How can they kind of be part of the city? How can they leverage this kind of wonderful world that kids are a part of before they come in the school doors? And that continues to drive my work. It's also motivated a lot by my 2 kids who you might hear in the background in today's recording too. But I'm really excited to join with you all and really learn, especially this idea around mathematics and thinking in that area. So really excited to be here. And then I think Kiera is next to me.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Vinci, before we jump in and introduce yourself? Beyond what you already said.
I'm Vinci. I'm a colleague of Tamyra's, a colleague of Kiera's, colleague of Richie's when I'm lucky. I am the director of STEM learning at Envision Learning Partners and work closely with Kiera at Connect Ed, partnering with San Diego Unified with the San Diego Enhanced Math Initiative. And I do a lot of work around instructional routines that support language development as part of math content learning.
Wonderful. And there might be a couple of people who pop in, and hopefully they'll have an opportunity to introduce themselves when they join. So let's jump into the conversation. We are here today because we were all curious for various different reasons and with various different backgrounds and vantage points in this idea of thinking about modernizing the mathematics learning experience, and what does that mean? How do sort of modern math classrooms look and feel different than what currently or previously existed? So let's start there and then see where the conversation takes us.
I'm happy to start if you.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Tamyra.
I think I'm just really happy to just be a part of this conversation because as a practitioner who is also trying to lead change, I just get light bulbs every day, we need to do this differently. We need to do this differently, especially being with students at the end of our K-12 experience in math. I just have numerous experiences with students that really inspire me to continue to innovate in this space. I think one of the most impactful ways that we can modernize the math experience, or one of the ways I really lean into, is democratizing quantitative reasoning, which sounds like a really that sounds really fancy, but just basically making math a communal practice. Instead of this individualistic, who knows the facts the fastest, or who can score the highest on the test to prove their aptitude, just thinking about math as a culture and math as a community practice is one of the biggest things, or one of the most impactful ways that we can kind of move the experience forward, especially as we're thinking about equity in the space, because we have all kind of identities that associate with, top, fastest, best. And we need to live in a world where we're working together alongside one another, where leadership is adaptive and flexible. And so I think that math as a community practice is one of the ways where we can kind of democratize quantitative reasoning. And also, just help more students feel like they belong into a math community. And then therefore, more students believing that they can be a mathematician in lots of different ways. So that's kind of where I've been, similar to what you said, Richie, just really trying to help the students develop a community of practice where they leverage each other.
Can I ask a follow-up question, or should we wait till everybody jumps in? Tamyra, are you okay with a follow-up question?
I'm okay with, yeah.
Okay, because I think some of what you said that you have found is really impactful is not just about the experience in school, but is actually prep for STEM careers, or really any career, as well as prep for college. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the connections between that idea of math as a community and as a culture and as a process of working together versus working for yourself as an individual. That one in particular.
Yeah.
Connected to preparedness for STEM career.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were building our, it was me and like two other people, we were building this computer coding apprenticeship program. And part of it was, taking coding classes like as an empathy experience. And then also just kind of being alongside them in their learning environment. And one of the things that I learned just from talking to employers, STEM-oriented employers, in this case, information technology, folks have to learn how to fail fast, because, you're moving through what they call sprints. So we have this product update that needs to happen at this time. So you have to expose your vulnerability as soon as possible. Like, I'm stuck on this. And a lot of times when people are working on projects or working on an update together, they're working on teams. And a lot of times they do what they call paired programming in the context of computing, like they have to work side by side with somebody so that you have more than one eye kind of on the code. And so that requires, again, like you to, reveal your vulnerability, be able to work alongside others, and solve a problem like in a community of learners. And I'm sure that, IT is not the only place where those type of changes are occurring. And as we think about the STEM work environment, because as Catherine was talking about before, when we think about emerging technologies, those emerging technologies don't happen in silos and vacuums. They happen, on teams in community, and in communities that can, kind of design together and tinker together. And so I'm often talking to the students about being part of learning communities and being part of problem solving communities. And that's why I ask them to, kind of work together and tinker together outside of my expertise, so that they can learn how to leverage the knowledge kind of their community, and also leverage the information that we, always readily have available, whether that be via the internet or other technical documentation that we might have access to as STEM professionals or as any type of professional. So I think that's very important in terms of like adapting student kind of experience away from this individualism that has traditionally been a part of the math culture, the academic math culture.
I'm just going to piggyback off this idea of building community. I found that obviously, you know, a lot of my sixth graders come in with fixed mindsets. They've developed in math, and you know, this whole idea of growth mindset, how important it is. We have to reverse that fixed mindset, and to do that, you have to have a community of culture of kindness, of inclusion, compassion, and I've found that a good way to achieve this is through these things, through community meetings where, you know, we open up math class with just a real informal conversation about what we did over the weekend, likes, dislikes, things we're looking forward to, things we're worried about. And it's almost like they have practice at becoming vulnerable, right? You know, and putting themselves out there. And we relate to one another. We talk about shared experiences. And so when you start out math class like this, when it comes time to doing the math, I find that students are a lot more willing to be vulnerable and take those risks. And when you know someone and when you can relate to someone, you know, you're a lot less likely to treat them mean, and you're a lot more supportive. And so I found that these community meetings really provide a good foundation and classroom culture for my students to develop growth mindsets.
Yeah, and really the synergy between what Tamyra you just said and Richard, what you just shared, for me is like really around this idea of like humanizing and democratizing the learning experience, which, you know, I think one could say that probably about any of the disciplines. As you were talking, Tamyra, about this idea of like working together, I had this vision of kind of like, you know, the professor who's a math professor in front of this gigantic old chalkboard, right? And like that one student who's elevated to the level where they can collaboratively work on some totally unsolvable problem, right? But what like that to get to that point, it's like a very solo activity when you talk about math in the context of like the academic system. It seems like, and oftentimes, you know, I worked in a program called CalTeach that was supporting undergraduate students who are working on math and science majors to become teachers, and they would often talk about how it is a very individualistic experience. They're pitted against each other. It's very competitive. And at the same time, the only way to kind of get through the workload was to work collaboratively. So they find ways to build community and collaboration despite the environment that they're in, right? And you know, there's, you know, that secondary, post-secondary system exists, and maybe there's movement to change some of the aspects of that post-secondary experience. But I think part of what has existed in the past is this notion that you need to prepare students for that, right? Out and like separate from, or not separate, but like not taking into consideration all of the other applications, all of the other spaces where students can be prepared for success in like career and college, where their math skills are going to be applicable and used. And I think that, so that I just really like this idea of like of the collective and the ways that we can be successful by putting all our heads together is really resonating for me right now. And I think in a world where, you know, answers are at our fingertips so readily, right? Like to find the correct response for something isn't really the work, but the work of like sense making, the work of problem solving, of like thinking outside of the box, of taking the data and telling a story with it, right? That's the hard part.
Yeah, it's really neat to think about this idea of community building within, but then also how, as this idea of modernizing mathematics, how you could connect mathematics more and more with communities beyond the school walls and those worlds, in kind of compassionate and caring relationships that are there, but also kind of with a critical stance on the world. So I'd be curious as you're thinking about this idea of modernizing math. Just those kind of multiple worlds, thinking about the power of within the classroom, and then thinking about how those classrooms can be powerful and engaging with the bigger problems, people, places that are kind of central to young people's lives. So kind of breaking out of that mold too.
Mm-hmm.
I love what you just brought up, Catherine, because it connects with something I think a lot about, which is the role of language in math learning and math classrooms. And when you kind of open up who the audience is, when you're like setting the expectation that we will communicate our ideas to someone else, not just to the teacher and not just on the test, but to real other humans. This idea of like multiple worlds, like thinking about there are lots of audiences inside the classroom that are real. And if you have the right community kind of culture cultivated, then you're interested in each other's ideas. And that sort of motivates the work of expressing ideas and communicating reasoning. But then when you think about like the multiple audiences outside the classroom and outside the school that are potentially there ready to hear student work and student ideas, that just kind of breaks down the barriers of potential audiences, which is really useful when you are wanting to encourage and cultivate students to refine the way that they express their reasoning and their ideas.
Mm-hmm. I also heard you talk about criticality, like being critical, like using quantitative reasoning as a way to, deconstruct like inequity or to reimagine conditions. And I think that that's particularly important when we think about communities who have been traditionally marginalized in our societies. We have to, because a lot of times kids ask, what do we use math for? Like, what do we use this for? Or will I ever use this again? And I've heard adults tell children, no, you won't. And I don't think that that is the proper way that we need to engage that dialogue. We actually need to build experiences to where students are acting as mathematicians with a critical lens. So I tell my students all the time, we hear conversations about reparations, which is largely like a social conversation that we're talking about, is it viable? Is it reasonable? But it's not going to go anywhere policy wise if there's not a math model to correspond with the rationale. So we have to position our students to be prepared to be at those seats of power, even if we want to deconstruct the systems of power. Somebody has to be at the seat to start the deconstruction process. Or somebody needs to be able to replace whatever problematic system is at play with a new system. And at every turn, it requires scientific, quantitative reasoning. So if we position students to use quantitative reasoning for, critical reasons, it helps them, it empowers them to see that math can be a tool for liberation. So I think that that's also really, really important. And I think it will require a lot of us as practitioners to learn more about the tools of mathematics, because I oftentimes find myself, kids are like, what do you use a limit for? I'm like, that's a great question. Let me let me talk, let's think about it. Let me noodle on it. Let me find a future situation in which you would, use that tool. Let me give you a context, and explicitly begin to teach students, not just this is a hammer, here's this part of the hammer, here's the claw, here's the handle, but it's like hammers are used for nails. So whenever you need to put a nail in or take a nail out, we have to think about, math concepts and math tools kind of in those ways, and also put students, like Vinci was saying, in positions to, kind of talk to audiences about their findings.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me, I think a lot about how much of the math that I teach should be taught in context and how much should be taught kind of as pure math, like math is magic. Math is just this really cool thing, not in context. One of my professors way back when told me something I never forgot, that math is the language that scientists use. But I don't know, I'm just curious what you guys think in terms of like how much math should be taught in context and how much should be just pure out of context math in the classroom.
Well, as everybody's thinking of a response, I just want to share that one of the things that I witnessed in your classroom, Richie, was just the power of pure naked problems being used in number talks. And I think the one that I was really struck by was, it was 12 times 25. Do you remember that one? Do you remember that day?
I do actually, yeah.
Just the variety of ways students thought about that naked problem, which is the beauty of number talks, is opening up that space for different approaches and creating a chance for people to look at each other's approaches. There was so much value in just like motivating interest in different ways of looking at the same thing. And that was a completely decontextualized problem. But I'm not making an argument one way or the other. I'm just saying that was one case where I was reminded of the sort of the power and the value for learning and for identity and for the community, and for language development too, of decontextualized problems.
I also think too, in trying to hook students, because we're competing with TikTok and Netflix. I mean, there's so much out there that we're competing with. What's the best way to hook students? Is it math in the context of something they're interested in, or is it through number talks where you're just looking at the magic of math? I think about that quite a bit.
I think one thing that's kind of maybe a little bit at the nexus, and to introduce a new little topic, this idea of context, and then thinking about sort of democratization, and Tamyra, what you were saying about, how do we create a revolution? I think, data science has been this sort of quote unquote hot topic. A lot of schools our districts or kind of systems are thinking about how to incorporate a data science learning experience or pathway into the K-12, K-14 learning experience. And so I think I'm wondering a little bit about that, the role of that as both context provider, potentially implications. What are some of the affordances of that kind of bringing the math and the science together in a data science kind of packaging? And then, what are some of the trade-offs or potential pitfalls? I think, and Jessica is just joining us. Jessica, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. I apologize for being late. I was in a prior meeting. My name is Jessica Walsh. I'm the middle school math resource teacher for San Diego Unified. Thank you for having me today.
Hey.
So Richie just asked a very big open question about the value of teaching math in context versus teaching pure math or the magic of math in a decontextualized way. And then Kiera brought in what about data science as like a whole world of contexts in which students are leveraging math and science practices and tools. So that's where we're at. Add or edit what I just said, Kiera, Richie, as needed.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Tamyra or Catherine, did you want to get started on that?
I think it's a great question that's kind of open-ended, or there's no right or wrong answer, like all context specific or all context neutral. And then also I'm just reminded of like what context, is it like immediate math problem to that class and a social problem they're encountering or what's going on at lunch, right? Versus looking at like national election data and making conclusions from that. So I think this idea of kind of scale, context, relevance is just super exciting and important. And I think teachers are always kind of grappling with it. And then researchers are too, like what's the right balance? And I think there's a lot of neat opportunity to kind of think about data science as this nice hub for drawing together language arts and math and science, especially if you're kind of holding on to this idea of it's not neutral, it's not value free, it's part of a broader kind of cultured, empowered dynamic going on in our society. So I think data science can be nice in that way. I think it's a little problematic if it's kind of data science and not taking a deeper look, both at the disciplines it's a part of and also the structures that are shaping it. What's valued, what's it for? Those kind of questions. But I think there's some neat opportunities both ways.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm the kind of person, I'm a stance kind of person. So, I actually think that math as abstraction is cultural. And it's a pretty new kind of cultural advancement as we think about like human activity, like human or societal math activity. Like most of the human activity around math, I would argue, has been applied, like math for a reason. So I think our commitment to the abstraction is cultural. For a number of reasons. I won't bore everybody with that, with my personal thesis on like why that is, but I think that I'm really interested in data science because it's a great entry point into the fact that even these abstractions that we use are actually models. So thinking about these math tools as models that we use to kind of analyze and predict like what's going on and what could potentially happen, I think is really synergistic, could potentially be synergistic for students. Does that mean that everything that you talk about in math has to be context oriented? I don't. But I do think that if a course is too abstraction oriented, students are kind of missing the point of like what we use math for, which is to model. And I think it does lend itself to the hegemony, which is why we see like a constriction about who is involved in the post-secondary math community. Because if you don't speak that language, or if you're not enthralled by those abstractions, then people automatically feel like, oh, I don't belong. Or people point at you, directly or indirectly and say, you may not belong. But there's so many technical tools that actually, kind of do a lot of that nowadays that I feel like, applied mathematicians, especially when we think about big data, spend a lot more time trying to figure out like, how do we visualize this and this data, and how do we communicate about it, and how do we make sure that this data system is actually providing clean data. So I think that we have to really, like, I feel like we gotta, kind of rethink about like, the place of those abstractions, like these equations, functions, concepts that we teach, like a laundry list, like what are they really? And of course, students have to have practice in using some of them, so that they can detect whether an error has occurred as they're using technology tools. So I'm not saying, no, you should never deal in abstraction, but I think a course that's too abstraction oriented is not going to be an inclusive learning space, and it's not going to help kind of democratize the math community like we've been talking about.
I have a 6-year-old and a 3-month-old, and I think a lot about the world they're going to inherit, from us. And it worries me, of course, right, with climate change and all the geopolitical stuff happening. And, I feel like we have a responsibility to, teach, to get them data literate. And, and math is the language scientists speak. And I also think that, a class that's too abstract is a disservice to, this generation and the generations to come.
I feel like what I'm being reminded of, I think it's a little bit of a riff off of what you were saying, Tamyra, is just like about like how we learn. Math has been an applied subject for most of its history, right? And as beings, we learn by doing, and we learn by doing in community. And so that's kind of like, I sort of, for me, that feels like axiomatic. So then in that sense, like, how do we do together something it has to be about a particular context. It has to be about how am I making sense of this in relationship, these concepts in relationship to some kind of other material, just aside from just the idea itself. But I do think, and I do think that's partially why data science has become such a sort of a hot topic, and something that folks have sort of hope to kind of like hang their hat on that. They're like, okay, so we're doing the context thing now because we're doing data science. And I wonder, or I worry maybe that also will kind of fall victim to some of the same things that like math instruction sometimes falls victim to, in that like without that understanding as instructors, then you kind of fall back on the like, well, you just do it like this because this is how you do it. And so, I think about teachers, and I think about, people who are coming into the profession and how they adapt without having had those kinds of learning experiences themselves. And what does it mean to help, the next generation become data literate while we are also trying to get data literate.
I think there's so much possibility for a different learning experience because of the training that the people who are going to teach data science are going to need to go through themselves as learners. And there's so much like mucking around and trying and failing. Like you were talking about, Tamyra, the failing fast is the way that you learn to model data and to use data analysis tools to model and analyze what is and predict what could be. And there's just so much tinkering. And so that process as a learning process feels like a huge opportunity for a process to learn how to teach. And I hope that we realize that potential as a community of professionals and educators.
I do apologize for coming in late, so you might have talked about this a little bit already, but I just think as, as a whole system of our path in math, from, preschool, like early literary, starting with your 3-month-old Richie to, our being educators in the system and learning it ourselves. But we've been on this path for over 100 years of this same, like, we're going to do algebra 1, we're going to do geometry, algebra 2, and then we don't even see data science in early elementary or middle. So it's like really brand new for everybody. I'm hearing where data science is like a pathway versus what we all need to be like learning along this journey in education. So anyway, just I'm excited to be a part of this work because I think it's really, really important. And, where our district has been doing a lot of work with it, and would love, to hear more about like where you all are at and the support that we're going to be getting, so that we're all, doing it together.
Yeah, I think this idea of a pathway is kind of an interesting one, because it's sort of, it's already fitting it into a particular mold, right? And the mold that you were talking about a little bit, Jessica, this model for what it means to be in school, right? And like be a part of like a bell schedule and get the right credits that you need to go to the right next thing. And like, so it's already being kind of like slotted in. And, I mean, that is like a whole other larger conversation that we could record on another day. But I do think the one thing that I appreciate about that, I feel like that data science has brought to the conversation, and I think connects a little bit, Tamyra, to what you were saying at the very beginning around like, thinking about sort of like both ends of the learning experience. But I feel like what data science has really brought to the forefront a little bit more is like, what is this K-12 sort of back learning experience actually preparing folks for? And I think that has been really rich. It's been really rich to see how, like I've been thinking about San Diego, Jessica, about how they're like really diversifying the secondary experience for students so that it can be more tailored, or like opening up the opportunity for being prepared in mathematics for like a number of different post-secondary experiences. And so that to me seems kind of like something new. I don't know if it's modern yet, but it's new.
Any closing thoughts to send us out?
I just like this idea of having experiences of empathy that inform our practice. So what you're saying, Jessica, really resonates, with me in terms of like the opportunity that educators will have from, learning something new and thinking about data science as a new way. And I do agree that we're going to have to think about the culture of math very differently. Before we get to modern, we're going to have to recognize math not as this just concrete thing, and think about it as an ever-evolving culture, because it's a tool that human beings use for particular reasons. And so as our technology advances, so does mathematical culture advance. And we have to think about math as culture. We can't just think about it, you know, as an academic discipline, which is, I think, where we're getting kind of stuck, because we're trying to get students prepared for academic math in college, but that's, you know, keeping the scope here. And right now, we need everybody to be data literate, like Richie is saying. So that means that our concept of math education has to, you know, be more responsive to, you know, what the problems, opportunities, conditions that are already present, that a lot of communities are being left out of because they're still being just prepared for standardized tests to make sure that they can get to, you know what I'm saying? Like, we need to be in a place where students are understanding the endpoint is not just getting into the college you want to or getting that degree, but there's other endpoints and that are kind of beyond that. So I'm excited about, you know, continuing to work in the community to advance math culture.
I would also just add a really interesting theme that kind of came up here that I think, if you think about kind of modernizing math, modernizing data science, any of these disciplines, is there's a real importance to focus on kind of where's it going. But just hearing you all speaking tonight, this idea of the power of now, this moment with particular kids in the classroom and these discussions, that is a powerful kind of place or endpoint that was really exciting to hear about in your teaching work. And I just think it should also kind of be part of a discussion as we're going forward. Yes, where are we going? Why? For whose purposes? You know, what is this larger process about? Who is it serving? Who is it not serving? And then also really kind of treasuring the fun, the community building, the empathy, the problem solving, that kind of in the moment process in mathematics and data science sense making. I think we don't want to lose track of that as well.
I wished I was here for the beginning of this discussion. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it. So thank you. Thank you for having us today.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for taking time. I really appreciate it. And this was a very rich discussion. I was glad that I was able to be a part of it. And I will, as I said, share the recording, what happens to the recording with you all once I know what that is. And yeah, just
We'd love to hear from anybody who listens to this, any feedback, reactions, questions, and your ideas.
yes.